Okay, welcome back to the Hogtown Podcast, episode 58. Last week we had former Chief Planner Greg Lintern. Now we're pleased to be joined by current Chief Planner Jason Thorne. Thanks for joining.
Thanks a lot for inviting me.
And prior to this, you were Chief Planner. Well, I guess you had a private sector job, but you were at one point Chief Planner in Hamilton.
Not quite Chief Planner.
Okay.
So for Hamilton, I was there for 10 years. My role was as General Manager of Planning and Economic Development. So
That's right.
Hamilton General Manager is kind of what Toronto would call a Deputy City Manager.
It was just like blended role of like economic development and planning.
Yeah, so I had the planning division was part of my portfolio, but I also had economic development and transportation and real estate and arts and culture and tourism and by law enforcement. That's a fun one.
Big portfolio.
So it was a larger portfolio. Yeah.
And did you move to Toronto for this role?
I did.
How's that
After getting the job, I moved here, and it's been great. I haven't lived in Toronto. The last time I lived in Toronto, I think it was like 2001. So it's been a while. It's changed a lot.
Yeah. As is Hamilton, for what it's worth.
As is Hamilton.
Every time I go into Hamilton, I'm like, always, I mean, there's parts of Hamilton that, still need some love and time, but there's parts of Hamilton that are really cool now, that are really like, they've had a moment, right?
They've had a moment. It's a great city. I mean, the pace of change is much slower. I think, what Hamilton's, housing starts I think when I got there was about 2,000 a year. And, in my final year, we were up over 3,000. So it's, that's a lot for Hamilton, but, change, compare that pace of growth to Toronto, it's much more slow.
And it's probably slowed to a certain extent, I imagine.
It has also slowed. Back to 2,000 or lower at this point.
Yeah. I don't think it's quite that bad. So actually, what are the stats I like to use in Hamilton? So the year before I got there, the number of new housing units built in the downtown core of Hamilton was 2.
Right.
Not 2 projects.
Yeah.
Units.
Wow.
So, a big part of what I was focused on there was trying to actually start attracting investment and activity into the core.
Yeah.
And, we started to see, my last year there was like, 4 times as many cranes in the air as there were units built.
Yeah. That's right.
Before. So, it's been great.
How much is this weird city? This is like almost how it was in the 70s to 90s in most cities where all like the value and interest like fled the core.
Yep.
So like on the mountain and so on, it's beautiful. And like since then, most other cities have converged where downtowns have become more safe, more popular, more expensive. And Hamilton, it's like still kind of like moving in that direction, it feels like.
Yeah. I mean, there was success in having, at least some activity happening in the core.
Yeah.
So there's quite a number of units built there in the time that I was there. We actually did a very concerted effort to reach out to builders in Toronto to say, hey,
to attract them,
like, hey, come for a visit. Let us show you some things. And it took us a while, but eventually we got there. I mean, Hamilton's had
it's got
couple
the
of good years.
of a really great city. Like the downtown core, the old character of the city. It really does have a lot of good characteristics.
Yeah, it does.
And now you're in Toronto. I mean, there are probably some obvious things that are different, but what are the big things that you did not expect to be different? You'd expect, I guess, like much bigger city, more going on, more development. Are there anything that were unexpected that were like, oh, this is quite different?
Necessarily unexpected. I mean, the scale is obviously very different. The biggest project we would be working on in Hamilton, there's 50 of those happening right now in the city of Toronto. So, it is in a smaller community, you can kind of wrap your head around everything that's happening. Like, I generally know all the major projects happening in Hamilton. I can't say that about Toronto. There's just too much
impossible.
going on. But otherwise, like the issues that Toronto's wrestling with are not that different than other big cities. Like, how are you managing growth? How are you dealing with change in neighborhoods? How are you dealing with, heritage? All of these sorts of things are
one of the things we talked about with Greg Lintern was also like he was recollecting the pre-amalgamation era of the city of Toronto, because I guess he worked in that time for the city of Etobicoke. But also, it was interesting to just hear him talk about like the very, very significant geographical diversity of the city of Toronto.
Yep.
The difference between Scarborough and downtown and Etobicoke and North York, and how that
attitudes towards growth and so on.
Mindset, the culture, the political culture, but also just like the planning context, right? Of like very, very different parts of the city, very different transit infrastructure,
larger
different parts of the city,
so on.
et cetera.
Yeah, it is a diversity in kind of all senses of the word. And again, a very similar situation to Hamilton. You had your core, you had your suburbs. It is also amalgamated at the same time. One of the things people don't realize with Hamilton is I think the number is like 80% of Hamilton is rural.
Yeah.
My very first planning committee in Hamilton, we dealt with like a a 20-story condo building, a suburban subdivision, and a rural farm suburbs. And it's like, okay,
In the
That's
same
you- proper
you just
diversity.
did an entire career of planning issues in one meeting.
Yeah,
You don't get a lot of those farm subdivisions.
Not a lot
in
of farm
Toronto, right?
subdivisions in Toronto. So there, to your question, just one of the differences: a lot fewer farm retirement lots.
And that-
Toronto than-
we mentioned when we spoke with Greg, I see him as almost like a transition planner. Just during his tenure, we went from like pre-Greg Lintern, like the overwhelming consensus on council, certainly if not in planning, was to maintain and reinforce the stability of neighborhoods. During his time, we saw laneway suites, garden suites, multiplexes, kind of introducing housing options in neighborhoods. A lot of this was kind of like formalized in John Tory's third term with the Housing Action Plan. And now you have, I think, the opportunity, but also kind of the challenge of like taking this momentum and pushing it forward with all that comes with it. Like, I would think that as a planner, this is, you probably want to be post-Lintern than pre-Lintern because you get to do a lot of stuff, but it's also, you're actually doing much more work. Like, how's that been?
Yeah, I mean, huge respect for Greg. He was definitely sort of a very transformative chief planner. And you're right, it was sort of in his tenures when a lot of key things started that we're still continuing today around rethinking the overall urban structure of the city.
Sacred cows, frankly. For a long time.
Some of those, and just really thinking about how do we want to accommodate growth, and what does, really starting to wrap our heads around what does a city of 4 million look like. If you go back into like the 2000s, the 2010s, it was very much an urban structure built around, the limited number of nodes and corridors and nothing in the neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And that
Tall and sprawl.
Is
one way to characterize it.
It was a bit more like tall and nothing.
Yeah, fair. Tall and stability.
Yeah, so there you go.
Yeah.
And I think Greg started to put a few key pieces in place that really shifted that, and we're continuing to do that. And it really does mean, I look at it, big picture, it really is a very different urban structure, what the next 20 years is going to look like than what the last 20 years.
Yeah, very much so. And we were chatting about this a bit before we recorded, but one of the things that at least my perception of it is that most people don't pay attention closely enough to follow when policies come into effect, but they do start paying attention when something new gets built on their block. Yeah. And now, like a couple of years in, we're starting to see every single neighborhood in Toronto has seen the first multiplex, maybe the second, third, fourth multiplex. We're starting to see the first major streets buildings. We've seen lots of garden suites and laneway suites. Now you see people starting to wake up to the reality of these policy changes, right? Whether they like it or they don't like it, it's now visible. You can see these things built in the places where you live, right? So,
yeah, and certainly that's when it does kind of become more real to people. It is hard to, we do a lot of engagement. We're doing a big citywide zoning initiative or a citywide policy initiative, and we try to kind of show people what that could look like, what that change is going to be. It's kind of hard for it to really be real to people when it's words on a piece of paper, than when it's a building going up on their street. We're starting to see, which is a good thing, a very good thing. We're starting to see things get built that tie back and have been enabled by the policy shift, and
people being able to benefit from them. It used to be that if you could not afford a house, your vision of your options were live in a really big mid-rise or tall building. Now, like, you have multiplexes,
move out to the suburbs,
or move out to the suburbs. And I think that I think it's kind of cool. I mean, like the name of the framework was exploring housing options in neighborhoods. We now have more housing options in neighborhoods, and I think some people are really appreciating that.
We do, and sometimes it's important to kind of go back to those first principles to explain why we're on the path that we're on, and that ends up being a lot of what I do. And I do a lot of going out and talk to residents associations and neighborhood associations, and we talk about those issues. We talk about creating more different types of housing options for different family types, for different incomes, different tenures, all of these sorts of things, and not just creating more housing options, but creating them in more parts of the city.
Totally.
And you have to do both, and it's important to talk about both. This isn't just about let's introduce a new missing middle housing form, but only here, not here. So, if you look at the work we've done around major streets and avenues and neighborhoods, generally they've been looking citywide. Yeah. I think that's an important aspect of, we want people in all parts of the city, in all neighborhoods, to have access to all types of housing.
Benefit.
If you're a downsizing senior, you don't have to move from
you can stay where
North York to Toronto, East York to find the housing type that you need, that you can find that in your own neighborhood.
Yeah, I think this like idea of like aging in place is really important, or even having the option for your kids to live nearby. Like we both have kids, and like the first thing I did when I had kids was move as close to my parents as possible, because that's the ultimate parenting hack. And like in some neighborhoods that hasn't been an option just because the houses were too big and too expensive, frankly. So like now we're starting to add a little bit.
It is a layer I find of like, the term affordability gets thrown around a lot, and different definitions in different contexts. There's sort of absolute affordability in terms of what's the rent, for a unit, but broadly defined anywhere in the city. Whereas another layer of affordability is thinking, hey, my parents grew up in Bloor West Village. I want to live in Bloor West Village. A house in Bloor West Village is going to cost me $7,000 a month to rent. What if I could have an option that was $4,000 a month to rent in Bloor West Village? Doesn't meet the like big A definition of affordability, but otherwise that neighborhood would be inaccessible to a young family or something like that, right? So I think there's a lot of really like positive downstream effects of that, because we're seeing a lot of these neighborhoods just hollow out over time.
Yeah, and that's another thing that I often talk about when I'm out meeting with different residents associations. Actually, I have a bit of a standard presentation I give a lot of the times to neighborhood groups, and one of the slides I like to show is population change over the last sort of 20, 25 years, because what you see is, certain neighborhoods have grown a lot, but many neighborhoods in the city have either stagnated or even declined over the last 20, 25 years. And it's hard for people to kind of wrap their heads around that, because wait a sec, it's not like we demolished houses. In fact, we built more houses. But it's like, okay, but the number of people living inside those houses is going down. And
you see schools shuttering in some of these neighborhoods as well.
And I've gone to neighborhoods where they've talked about, we're worried about losing our grocery store and these kinds of venues and services. And so talking about the change that's been happening from a planning standpoint as bringing growth to those neighborhoods and some of the positive benefits of that growth. Again, we can't stop telling that story, because for some of it's like, we talked about that 2 years ago in the policies, but not
worth repeating.
Yes, it's worth repeating. And again, now that people actually see the buildings coming into their neighborhoods, to remind people of kind of the genesis of those policies and the planning rationale and the urban change rationale for why those were put in place.
Yeah, the urban change, you said we'll probably see a much different urban structure over the next few years than we have over the past few years. It almost feels like the policy is timing, the timing is pretty good, like alongside what's going on in the market. So what's going on in the market is like high-rise condo pre-construction sales are dead. Condo, like high-rise construction costs are just like hard to make work. So you're seeing a lot more developers operate at the missing middle and mid-rise scale. That's certainly where we operate. And now I see most of the policy focus, correct me if you think that's wrong, on how to make that scale work well. And it's kind of like, it seems like the stars are aligning on this, which is to say there's a big opportunity.
Yeah, well, certainly a lot of our attention these days is on that mid-rise scale. And for a whole host of reasons that we can get into. But I'm glad you kind of phrased it that way, because I think one of the problems of planning in the past, going back the last 20, 30 years, is it always lags behind the market. And so the market would shift. And then a decade later, planning policy would catch up. And then the market would shift again. And so again, I think an important just big picture approach to how you do policy, how you do zoning, is to not try to be overly predictive or prescriptive about where you're planning and accommodating for growth, because the market can shift very quickly. And so I think what we're starting to get in place, more work to be done, but I think what we're starting to get in place is lots of opportunity and potential for many different types of housing forms, many different types of building product in many different parts of the city, so that as the market does shift, because it will shift again. Like I think mid-rise is having a bit of a moment, but it will shift again. And I want to make sure that we've got the policies and the permissions in place for when it does shift, that there's a place for that to shift too. So you're not having that kind of lag where policy is holding back construction. And I think that's one of the good things about the place that we are getting to. We're not fully there yet. Again, more work to be done. But it's kind of having this like open, flexible approach out there. So, if the market turns away from investors and towards end users, well, guess what? We got a whole bunch of opportunity out there to build the kind of product that end users want. And it shifts back to investors. We've got some opportunity out there to build that kind of product. So.
That tenure change is actually one of the most significant that we've observed, is just the shift from for sale product to for rent product. And I do think that we're almost overcorrecting to for rent in some respects. And I think the for sale product, we've always sort of we've correlated that to just condominium, where I'm loving to see a lot more sort of boutique for sale experimentation, like these like fourplex condos, these types of things. I think are there's such a shortage of variety at the for sale end of the market. Like you can either buy a house or you can buy a condo in the sky. And I think there's so much opportunity to build stuff in the middle. Right now, obviously, a lot of the incentives are nudging people towards rental, but that won't last forever.
I think one of the things on the flexibility point that's healthy about a market correction like this is we start when the market keeps going up and up and up. Basically, everybody in the cost structure just takes a little bit more, including government, like not just through taxes, development charges, and so on, but also just like requiring more urban design stuff that add costs. So like one obvious example that comes to mind is the old urban design guidelines required these like 45-degree angular planes that introduce transfer slabs at every floor, and therefore you can't do precast and it's more expensive. What I'm seeing now is like, how do we deliver desirable housing that is in keeping with, the urban design vision we have for the city, but that can be built cost effectively? And you almost need a market correction for that to reemerge as a priority. Like, let's not make this stuff more expensive than it needs to be. And that flexibility will persist across markets, because even when the market comes back, it's still a good idea to build stuff that is still nice, but could be built cost effectively at scale.
Yeah, I think one of the positives that's sort of come out of the challenging market conditions we're in, and I see this as something that's going to last beyond when the recovery happens, is in the planning world. Again, if we go back the last couple decades, there certainly wasn't enough thinking and consideration about the market and about actually how the market would respond to whatever policy initiative we're putting in place. So I know, like in city planning last year, we actually created a new position of a senior land economist to embed within the policy team, so that we have not only planners and urban designers and transportation planners and those very important professions weighing in on a policy initiative, but we bring that land economics lens to it as well. And you may have started to see some of that in some of the planning.
Did you not have the city's land economist at the Missing Middle Summit?
This was Graham Hayes. Was because I met Graham before he had this role, and I didn't even know he worked at the city. I met him at an event we hosted. I'm like, oh man, this guy's so like he's so smart. Like he thinks about housing. Not to say we think about it perfectly right, but like he's thinking about it how we think about it. So when I saw him get that, I don't know if you made that decision. I thought it was a great decision.
and
he's very good.
And one of the most recent reports we brought forward just a few weeks ago around our unlocking mid-rise initiative, trying to look at ways we can facilitate mid-rise construction so it can actually take advantage of all these new zoning and policy permissions that are out there. And there's a pretty heavy analysis in there related to land economics and each of the kind of the potential policy moves, looking at it through many lenses, as we always do, but adding the economics. What does this mean in terms of
change the feasibility of
Does it change the feasibility? And I just think that's a really important lens to bring to policy work, because again, you're not doing even neighborhoods any favors by saying, okay, here's our policy regime for your neighborhood, and then it lands in front of a developer and they say, well, we could never build that. We'll never be able to do that profitably, so it doesn't actually get built. So I think that's it's one of the ways that I think in the long run, I think planning will be in a better position going forward, because of having to kind of go through a really challenging.
And if I understand, if I understand that correctly, does that mean that role is so new that this wouldn't have been a role within the planning department prior to this appointment? This land economics.
So we've had people who've had that expertise, but it has been sort of an official position of senior land economist.
And I guess to Chris's point, it's like when the market's going up, nobody's really paying attention to the dollars and cents as closely. But
I think that's like my understanding of a lot of the economic thinking let's say Graham, pre this role, pre even your appointment, was this like general idea that land values could absorb whatever requirements we put on development. So it's like DCs, it's almost irrelevant to the end price of housing because the market will set the price and land values will absorb it. And I like the flaw in that argument is that there are sites around the city that you can't build even if it's free. Like it's very hard. Well, it might be changing now because some of these hard costs are coming down, but it was very hard for a long time to build a condo at say like Jane and Shepherd, even with free land. And the more you encumber land with requirements, it just increases the parts of the city that are not economic development. And I think that like now it's a much like you could say, for example, we require cold faucets on all housing, and don't worry, this won't impact the end price of housing because the land values will. Like you could take it too far. And I think now we have a much more realistic, a better understanding of like all there are trade-offs. There are no easy solutions. We can't request things, require them, and expect no trade-off on the other side of like less housing being built. So I don't know if there's a question, but I think this is like a very positive development.
Yeah, and I think I would say, if you don't think about those things, then there might be sites that just can't develop, or importantly, just won't develop into sort of the housing form that the policy anticipates. And that was often some of the issue with mid-rise is, having areas designated for mid-rise is not new. There's a lot more of it now than there ever was before. But often you'd see situations where it's like, okay, this may permit a mid-rise building, but when you run the pro forma, it's like, but I got to get to 20 or 30 or whatever number of stories in order to make it pencil.
Make it work. Yeah.
To me, that also means that as municipalities and as municipal planners, we should look like, okay, if the vision here is mid-rise, what are all of it's not enough just to say, okay, the vision here is mid-rise, therefore mid-rise is permitted. You've got to go a layer deeper and say, okay, but what does it take to actually
do we actually want to
profitable?
What
does it take to actually get it constructed in that form? That's kind of the digging a little bit deeper that the land economics lens.
Can we talk on that topic? Maybe we could talk a little bit about, you guys are undergoing a mid-rise review to address some of these things, to look at areas where there may be requirements that sort of like shift the feasibility on some of these mid-rise projects. What can you tell us about that process, where you guys are at in that process? What are some of the findings that are coming out of that?
Yeah, so I would say in many ways it's the follow-on work to things like the Major Streets Initiative that created all these opportunities for as of right 6-story, 60-unit buildings. This follow-on work to the Avenues Initiative that creates, we added last year 280 kilometers of avenues to the official plan where you can have mid-rise.
Yeah.
So the Unlocking Mid-Rise Initiative is a very intentional effort to say, okay, let's now scratch beneath the surface a little bit more and say, okay, it's permitted. What will it take to get it built? And so we've had a lot of conversations with builders, with land economists, to say, okay, we've been looking at pro formas in the planning department. We've been saying, okay, what are the dials that we can move that can actually bring costs down, bring values up, that we can actually then see some of this product get built. And so we've identified in sort of the first wave of initiatives, we identified a few things. We brought them to council a few weeks ago, and they're as proposals. And so we'll be working through those and doing some consultation around those over the next few months. Some of the recurring themes that came up was around amenity space requirements and how that can impact construction costs on smaller scale buildings.
Yeah.
So that's a piece that we've put forward as a proposal as to whether or not we'd look at eliminating indoor amenity space requirements for mid-rise buildings.
Mm-hmm.
We heard a lot about garbage collection and loading requirements in buildings. So we're taking a look at that. We heard a bit about bike parking requirements and how those are managed in small scale buildings. So these are the issues that we kind of want to start digging into a little bit. We heard about side yard setbacks, which is another one that you guys talked about a lot. So just trying to understand how these impact the viability of development. And so, for so long, so much of the conversation was about zoning.
Yeah.
And that, zoning is the barrier, zoning is the big to crack. And, that's been loosened up quite a bit. Often what that does is it just kind of exposes the next layer of challenge. So we're kind of leaning into that next layer.
Yeah, and philosophically, even across those three things, amenity space, garbage loading, and bike parking, one way I think about this is like, you could have these things fully internalized through requirements in each building individually, or you could have them as like infrastructure for the city. So we have like city bike share, we have curbside pickup, and maybe something we could talk about is kind of like smaller garbage trucks and stuff like that. Amenity space, nice parks, nice public spaces. It's kind of like, I think we had this push for a long time to have every building. I assume you played SimCity back in the day.
Yeah, I did not.
Well, they had these like, I forget what they were called, these like monster buildings where like the idea was like you have your mall in the building and everything. You don't never have to leave your building, and it was almost like we were going in that direction. Whereas this is almost cliche at this point. Like the city itself is an amenity. Mm-hmm. We should have nice parks, nice public spaces. We should have good bike sharing infrastructure and good kind of like citywide garbage pickup, so that each individual building doesn't have to like carry all of this and internalize it at the cost of it being viable to develop in the first place.
Yeah. And again, I mean, the intention wouldn't be to prohibit it.
Sure.
So
absolutely.
If you're a builder and you're targeting a certain market and you think that market is not going to move into your building unless you've got a gym,
absolutely
build a gym.
Yeah.
What we're looking at is almost similar to the way sort of parking was treated when the parking minimums were removed, is a bit of a let the market decide.
Yeah.
Let the market decide what scale of amenity is necessary for the market you're trying to. Which goes
to the flexibility.
It all kind of goes back to that flexibility question.
Yeah.
And what we've heard from builders is that these issues are especially important in the smaller scale mid-rise buildings.
Yeah.
On a per square foot per unit, like fewer units trying to carry the cost of these things.
A lot less wiggle room to
like a type G is a type G, whether it's 40 units or 400 units.
Yeah. And even something like amenity space. I mean, if you have a 50-story tower on a podium, you've got some GFA that really can't be a whole lot of other things. So including
the terrace of the podium
amenity space makes total sense.
Totally.
in a very simple floor plate mid-rise building, every inch
you're giving away
potential.
a unit or two.
You're giving away
It's
a unit.
fighting for his life every inch.
It's also thinking not about mid-rise as being a smaller version of a high-rise building. It's about thinking about it as its own unique thing, and what is the unique policy environment and standards we want to create around this unique thing.
One way that I think about it, because we spend a lot of time underwriting sites and looking at performance and deciding which sites are viable, which ones are not, is that, let's say you take a 40-unit building, your margin as a developer is really like the last 3 or 4 units. It's not the first 35 units, because that's like almost break even. So when you look at these things and you realize that, hey, anything that impacts the ability for that last unit, whether it's an indoor amenity space or it's an oversized bike storage or it's whatever it is, right? Like it could tip it away from, because like, I only have 2 units in my profit margin, or I have 3 units in my profit margin. It could be the difference of like, I'm going to attract investors into this deal, or I'm not going to attract investors into this deal, right? So, it's encouraging to know that you guys are digging in at that layer.
On garbage, and again, like we could go however far we can go. My understanding of the challenge is, like, on one hand, we have type G loading spaces, which are quite large, easier to absorb if you're in a tower than a mid-rise building. And then we have curbside garbage pickup, which can get like unruly, let's say, at like 60 units.
A lot of bins in a 60-unit building.
In the middle, operationally, at least for us, though not in city permissions, it's private pickup, where we could get smaller trucks, as small as, like, in some cases, like a pickup truck. I don't, like, is it just that there's something in law that, like, doesn't allow for anything in the middle? And obviously there's a whole separate conversation as to whether solid waste management should be buying smaller trucks. But even setting that aside, like, there is a challenge, I guess, for having the city approve private pickup, because they don't control private pickup, and you might sell your building, and then the new owner now wants curbside pickup. What can you say about, like, why is it so bifurcated, where it's like curbside or very large loading space?
So there's a number of reasons, and I think what you kind of flagged is what we flagged as well, is like there's a missing middle of garbage collection.
Absolutely.
So one of the things we're trying to look at is how do we address the missing middle of garbage collection?
Totally.
So it's not just these two extremes. You're either type G with a big truck, internalized loading, or curbside.
That's right.
There are,
it's like a mess on a curb.
There is a range of options in between. What we identified in the report that we recently brought to council around unlocking mid-rise is it's going to be complicated. So we're actually going to be working with our waste management colleagues on a study of what are some of the other options out there, the kind of the stuff in between, and whether that is going to be smaller vehicles, tighter turning radiuses, on-site compaction, iceberg bins, curb. Like,
I love
let's
that.
look at what some of the other alternatives are that out there, because it can't just be as simple as like, well, okay, let's take a 70-unit building, put all the bins at the street.
Totally.
Like, that's not going to work.
Totally.
So I'd like to look at other jurisdictions and say, what are some other ways that cities have tackled this? Because there is, again, especially on the smaller scale buildings, those loading requirements can really kill your pro forma quickly. There's also, we also have a big concern about what it means for your ground floor program.
100%.
And especially on streets where we want to see ground floor retail, you end up with those like shallow, wide retail frontages, which kind of
one Rexall where we had like 5 cool shops before.
And so you don't have retail footprints that give you like the back of house that you need if you're going to run a coffee shop or a small restaurant or those sorts of things.
I think that you must have read this. There was this Azure magazine article where they took like 2 blocks on Dundas and they showed the existing kind of like fine grained retail pattern and what it would mean to redevelop this mid-rise with type G loading, and it just kills it all. And I love that we've gotten to it, because it used to be that, like,
we have an entire block that's an LCBO just a few blocks from here, right? That used to be probably 8 stores. Right now it's just one giant LCBO.
And not to be a victim or a martyr about it, but like, it used to be that, like, a lot of people would be like, oh, developers just hate fine grained retail. It's like, no, we have to like take 60 to 70% of our ground floor, and it's all like required space that we have no say over. So I think like that is an important consideration. I also like the idea that you kind of mentioned that one thing that makes us optimistic about a lot of these urbanism issues is like somewhere in the world has figured this out. And like, we just need to find that place in the world and figure out the political context and the legal context and apply it. Like, we're not inventing new science here, but like the idea of communal bins, like, I don't know how much traction that's got, but this is like the solution in tight mid-rise European cities where you just have these iceberg bins and they figure out the collection schedule and it works very well. How much of it like we have all these silos within municipal governments. Like, I guess one of the challenges, you could be very excited about this, but unless you get like 5 other departments excited and the mayor's office and a majority of council, like, I guess that's the ultimate challenge.
Yeah. And just thinking about it, holistically. So interestingly, the economic development team has taken an interest in this issue, and who would have thought that someday there'd be like planners and economic development professionals sitting around the table talking about garbage collection. But because from economic development, they're very interested in the health and vibrancy of our main streets, and especially small business. So they've got an interest as well. I think, and one of the reasons you want to do a deeper dive is you can't go into an issue like this with the blinders on about other impacts and implications if we do make a change, because many of the things could make garbage collection more expensive.
Yeah.
And so, if I'm in charge of garbage collection, I want to know these things, and I want that to be part of the discussion to say, okay, if this serves a different public purpose, maybe that's okay, but we're then going to need to explain to council that this may make how we do garbage collection, more costly, less efficient. Smaller trucks means more trips, more staff, all of these sorts of things. So you can't, as much as I have a particular reason for being interested in garbage collection, you can't discount what the other impacts implications will be, and that's why it's a piece of work that we're doing with the city planning's urban design team in conjunction with the waste management group, so that we are looking kind of at
presumably a lot of this comes down like the physical. I imagine that the physical constraint for a lot of these new building typologies is the lanes, whereas a lot of garbage collection would have been on the streets for bigger buildings, for your typical house. And, one of my observations as I tour more and more laneway houses, putting aside mid-rise, is that a lot of laneway houses could be as far in as like mid-block, but the garbage has to go to the front of the house that it's sort of like on the property of. Anything being looked at as it relates to like laneway house garbage servicing? Because I'm curious, as these lanes develop. Right now, you get a lane with like one laneway house. Presumably, in 20 years, you get a lane where 50% of the lanes are laneway houses. Right? What does that look like in sort of your vision?
I would say that one's a little lower down on the priority list in terms of like the amounts of laneway suites and garden suites we're seeing. I think the bigger issue from a garbage collection right now is the mid-rise. And I think just from a the development potential, the unit potential we could unlock if we get that right is significant.
Yeah. One of the challenges that I think about is like the way in which, to get a little bit off scope, the way in which we calculate property tax. Does it like how you would think about this if you did not know Toronto is that like if we have more homes with more people, we will collect more revenue. But it's not how it works. We almost like set the revenue and then we work back to like the rate that is applied to everyone. And it's kind of like it's kind of like, as I think about it, I'm not like a specialist. It's too bad because, you're saying that like changing the way we collect garbage can incur more costs. But if it unlocks more development of more homes and more people, it should be able to bear that cost. But that's not how we do property taxes. Like that seems kind of like a weird thing.
It is, and that becomes a deep discussion around reform of how municipalities are financed, because much of the growth-related revenues don't flow municipally; they flow provincially and federally.
Right.
And so, this is why there's been so much discussion lately about like reinvesting some of those growth-related revenues into the things that generate the growth in cities.
Totally.
It's been nice to see that conversation shift, and we're having that right now around and hopefully a new development charge program.
Yeah.
But you're right. Like it'd be nice if there was more of a direct.
We send a lot of our tax dollars out, even though to your point, like growth is responsible for a lot of those tax dollars. And the thing that's too bad about like even the development charge, like the federal provincial fund to backfill DC cuts, which I think is great. We're looking forward to it, but it's almost like everything becomes so political. It'd almost be good for like these levels of government just like allocate points for cities to kind of like spend on what they need to spend on.
Yeah, or just take key growth costs.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, in Toronto, transit is one of the biggies. In other communities, it might be an upgrade to their water treatment plant or whatever it might be, and take some of those costs and pay for them with some of the other revenue streams that flow from growth, not just the property tax revenues or the development charge revenues.
I think that's and we're seeing a bit more of that, but I think it could be more formalized.
I don't think this. Correct me if I'm wrong, and if we can't go here just because of where it's at in the process right now, but is there anything to be added to the news of the federal and provincial DC funding announcement? Like, where's the city at? What might we expect in terms of what's next?
Yeah. So don't have details yet, but I would say that was one of the things, that's been one of kind of the encouraging announcements that to me, that was a bit of a recognition that some of the costs that growth brings should maybe be paid for in ways other than the property tax or the development charge.
Totally.
As a principle, I think that's a very good principle to have in place. How that actually sorts itself out into the details of what the program looks like, don't know yet.
Yeah.
But I think it's good that all three levels of government are talking in that kind of language.
Yeah. We spent a lot of time talking about garbage. We also spent a lot of time talking about hydro connections and transformer placements. Like how much of this work is in collaboration or with an eye to like Toronto Hydro, and how we're like here we're recording this in our office in the Junction, and I keep mentioning this to when I talk to the city staff, like, and to Toronto Hydro. There was this effort about 20 years ago to bury all the electric lines along Dundas West here in the Junction, and to place below grade vaults within the right of way that are oversized, so that any new mid-rise development could kind of like plug into it.
And for what it's worth, to add trees to the public right of way. Like the Junction today versus 20 years ago is an incredibly different neighborhood, right? Aesthetically.
This seems to me like the pilot, like this happens all over the city, but just because we're here, we're very familiar with it. It seems like this is where things should go. But again, it requires not just alignment among certain municipal departments, but also Toronto Hydro. Are you spending a lot of time on these sort of questions, like transformers, especially? Like I presume from an urban design standpoint, we don't want like pad mounted transformers up and down all these major streets.
Yeah, it's another one that comes up a lot. It's one that lies a little outside of our sort of control and authority, but we've certainly kind of brought some of those concerns to Hydro that we've heard from builders. Actually, the mayor just had a motion very recently, a few weeks ago, around asking Hydro to kind of come back with looking at both standards as well as just kind of like timelines for responses and those sorts of things that's at the city we've been working on for a while. But those are other good examples, again, especially in a mid-rise scale building. The cost of that hydro vault or the GFA that takes away. Heard a lot at the multiplex scale as well. And then just the predictability of it. And I hear that a lot from builders as well, is
totally.
Go to a flat rate system, something like that, so there's no surprises.
Well, the other thing that I think sort of buried in Chris's question, and this is really like a long-term infrastructure planning question for hydro, which is well outside of the planning department's domain, but it is still done on a project by project, site by site basis, where it's like, hey, there's a site getting developed, therefore we need to factor in the hydro requirements for that site. You're getting all these like patchwork around the city where you might have poles on a street, but for like half a kilometer they go below grade because there's a new development there, versus effectively planning for growth on new avenues, let's say, where there is currently nobody actively demanding a new hydro connection, but that it will come because the policies are going in that direction. The land economic studies you guys are doing are going to push people in that direction. I think of our site, we have a site on Dufferin between Dupont and Davenport, designated as an avenue expansion around the corner from Geary, like cool area, a whole bunch of we're building a 60 unit mid-rise on that stretch. We're the first. We certainly won't be the last, but it's an old it's an old avenue, right? It's old hydro lines, it's old. And so we're going to put an underground vault in front of our block or our lot. And so you're going to see these lines come in, disappear, and then come back out and keep going, right? So, and everybody incrementally will have to do the same thing, which feels like from a capital planning perspective is like probably a pretty inefficient way to do it. I don't know, like if you've got enough visibility to know how that, the mindset on that might change, but
and I think you actually hit on back to our earlier conversation about how the urban structure of the city is changing. We're having way more growth potential, housing potential in many more parts of the city, and we talked about all the reasons for that and the positive aspects of that. One of the challenges of it is for service planning, because one of the responsibilities of city planning is to work with whether it's hydro or parks or the school boards or whomever to say, here's kind of where we see the growth happening so that they can do their 10-year capital planning and their long range growth planning. But of course, as that was easier to do 25 years ago when you can say, well, most of the growth is going to be in these three nodes and on these three corridors. Now it's more diffuse. So you're going to have more situations where it's, there might only be one or two multiplexes in that neighborhood that are kind of the first in, or there might be that one mid-rise building that's mid-block that's first in. It is becoming more challenging to try to do your long-term planning around your service delivery. It'd be cost prohibitive to say, well, we just designated 280 kilometers of avenues. Let's go service them all in the next 5 years. I'm not sure who's going to finance that investment. So, that is one of the real challenges of having, a policy environment that's more permissive of more types of developments kind of everywhere all at once. It certainly creates.
And maybe opportunities for other levels of government to get involved in helping plan for that long-term growth, like they do with transit, right? We see the provincial and federal government get involved in laying transit where we think growth is going to come, right?
So, and it comes back to sort of again the finance tool. So if we're trying to finance all of that infrastructure investment with revenue streams that come after the fact, that doesn't help a lot, or come at the moment of a development charge. Like we've got to open up these revenue tools. And that's why the conversation with the provincial and federal government is so important.
Well, one version of this that I was thinking about was like we repave roads and sidewalks all the time, kind of like here and there. It's like at the same time, let's put some vaults underground, because like I wonder what that incremental cost is once you're already ripping and repaving everything. But pivoting a little bit, I think you're a big cyclist. I cycle. I'm a bike share cyclist, actually. So like a point in favor of like my bike at home gets no use, and I have a bike share rack across from my house, and I use it every day. One thing I think about when I think about the long term, and so certainly in terms of planning for the future, is we're going to get more autonomous cars. I think when I think about autonomous cars, this is kind of like where the flexibility around parking minimums makes a lot of sense, because we could start making bets on how we think that future will go. But a future with more autonomous cars requires, as I think about it, more pickup drop-off space at curbs. But we also want more bike lanes between curbs and lanes. And I don't know, just throwing a curveball at you. I wonder like how much we're thinking about that yet, or just like how that'll change. Like the one thing we hopefully will be able to give up in this future is on-street parking, less on-street parking. But just like thinking about like the design of streets when we have more cars that don't need to park, but we also want more bikes. Like we're kind of like competing for a lot of the same space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's been a very active discussion. Less about autonomous vehicles, more about just pickup, drop, the ride shares, totally. The Uber Eats, all of those sorts of things.
The autonomous vehicles to me are sort of in the same category as ride share. The person's not stopping and parking and eating; they're just getting dropped off. Totally, right? Like so,
the ride share thing pressure is here.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I just see it growing. If ride share is like 5% of all rides, maybe it becomes like 30, 40, 50, like at some point.
Yeah. So I think we have been starting to look at especially pickup, drop off, visitor parking, these kinds of things, and how you actually. How do you align planning for those with new development? And, what we don't want to see is we start to carve deeply into building footprints to try to create, 5 off-street laybys for every building that gets built. But we also know, especially on some of the busier streets, that, that the pickup drop-off is going to happen. And so where and how you accommodate for that. And it's, back to the discussion around waste collection. There's so much competition for curbside. It's one of the most, some of the most precious real estate in the city is the curb space. I see that as, I would say still somewhat early days, but like, how are we actually going to build that into our design requirements, zoning requirements, and there is an upside to it in that, if it means we can have, less of the off-street parking and the costs and the impacts of that, great. But especially in kind of areas in transition, so areas that are, not as transit accessible right now, they will be, but in some cases, the density is coming in advance of the transit investment. How are you kind of dealing with that transition phase?
Yeah, I think you're totally right on this, like within the right of way, even just in this conversation, it's like, could we fit communal garbage pickup? Could we fit more bike share racks? We haven't talked much about trees, but we love street trees and street canopies, pickup drop off. Like there's just like, that's like a real
and all the stuff underground that nobody thinks about, but actually drives every decision about what happens at the surface is driven by what's underground.
Like, I think that like some billionaires should donate, to bury electric lines, if there's like some philanthropic thing that I think would make all streets way prettier. This is like I think we've spent a lot of time again over the past couple of cycles, focusing on what needs to happen and should happen on private property. And obviously like we need some of that, but there's so much that needs to happen on public property within rights of way that like, I think that tension will just kind of like increase over time.
It's already there. And how do we address it in a way where, this is less of a, in the older parts of the city, the right of way is the right of way. It's not changing. So everything's kind of constrained. Everybody compromises, and you try to figure it work somehow. You can. Toronto's interesting that we also have like some pretty significant new growth districts, like on the waterfront, up at Downsview, up at Woodbine, where we're building significant new neighborhoods in essentially a greenfield situation. And so how do you design those places in a way that you don't default to, okay, wonderful, every standard has been met, but we just created a 45-meter right-of-way in the middle of the city. So like, how do you kind of like those trade-offs and tensions?
I think it's Kipling and Dundas, 4 lanes in each direction. Where we want like an urban fabric. We're going to have a lot of high-rise. There's a new civic center, and you've sort of created this like, it's my impression when I drive through downtown Mississauga. It's like nobody wants to walk here. It's like a highway in every direction.
Ontario is a good example where a lot of good urban design and urban planning thinking, I think, has happened on the Huron-Ontario corridor. By the end of the day, you got yourself a 50-meter right-of-way.
Yeah, that's not pleasant.
It's not going to feel... And so thinking about all of the standards that come into play around, lane widths and soil volume requirements and setbacks from water, the setback between your root ball and your water main, and all of these kinds of things. This is like, again, a bit back to the conversation around, it's one thing to like do some zoning that says all things are allowed. You really got to get into the minutia and the weeds, because often those are the things that may seem small, but in the aggregate have such a huge impact on the built form that.
Can you talk, just because we sort of like touched on it briefly, but how do you think about trees and urban forestry in the context of some of this smaller infill stuff? Like naturally, we see a lot of this, the tension at the multiplex scale. There's been controversial headlines on trees as it relates to multiplexes in the city. How do you / the city think about that trade-off of, on the one hand, wanting to encourage these types of housing, more infill, more like neighborhood scale housing, but on the other hand, wanting to have protection of tree canopies, that type of thing? And like, what is the appropriate balance? Do we have that today? Are there still, changes needed to be made on that?
I think we're still looking at some changes in that regard. I think the urban tree canopy is it's hugely important. And we know a lot of Toronto's urban tree canopy today is coming from trees in neighborhoods. And we know how challenging in an urban environment it is to kind of try to retrofit them to insert a mature tree canopy into an urban environment is not an easy thing to do. So I think it is a really significant priority when we're looking at whether it's neighborhoods or whether it's major streets or avenues where we've got existing mature trees. I'm not saying it should be protect at all costs, but I'd say the bar's pretty high for like when it is appropriate to actually eliminate a mature tree. And certainly there's been cases, and I think where that's been approved, and as for a multiplex, and that's fine. The trade-offs were considered, and the tree was located in a place where it was totally going to preclude bringing in that new housing. And in those cases, you're going to need a tree permit, and issuing it's probably the appropriate thing to do. I do think for those, the developers who are in the multiplex space, if you want to turn neighbors against multiplexes real quick, start clearing the trees. Because
totally agree
when I'm talking to neighborhood groups, that is one of the top things I hear when there's that reticence about the multiplex activity. Sometimes it's too many houses, or it's a traffic, or it's a parking. Trees is like right up there. So I do think we have to find ways that's
where the politics could very quickly blow back on the industry, right?
The politics can go blow back quickly around that. And honestly, if we as we start to build more and more of them, if the trade-off is we see our citywide urban tree canopy starting to decline as a result, then we're going to miss other really important public policy objectives. So I know I'm not giving you a very direct,
it's a tough
yes or no, but I would say it is one of those things where it's going to be important to kind of find the right balance.
Well, objectively, we love building where there are mature trees because we know that the end product is more desirable and on a street that is more pleasant. And then it's that trade-off of viability or, whatever it is. And in some cases it's challenging.
Yeah, I think like the big challenge in my mind is like a desirable end state. Again, if you look at beautiful neighborhoods around the world, certainly in like urban neighborhoods, is a ton of trees within the right of way that provide a canopy. And then like the development permission, often kind of like street wall, no side yard setback, going back to that. But to your point, it's very hard to plant a mature tree, right? Like a tree starts as being not mature, and it takes 20, 30, 40 years. And it's almost like that, the saying of like the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't on a lot of these streets. So now it's a very real trade-off of this like beautiful mature tree in the way of new housing that can be replaced with 3 street trees in the right of way, but they're not as mature. They're not going to provide as much benefit. And it's very challenging.
Yeah. And it's like, I don't take, I've heard the kind of the cavalier approach sometimes of like, well, trees grow back. Well, okay, yes, but it takes 20 years. And also, seen proposals where it's like, okay, not only do you want to cut the tree, but you want to build in a way that actually you're not going to get a new tree because, you're not creating any sort of like front setback space where you could have it at the front either. So you're always going to have some sort of like,
on that, like, I don't know where this, the planning for tree planting within rights of way, presumably is also within urban forestry sort of domain. How much of that is sort of forward looking to say, hey, where are the neighborhoods where growth is happening? And it might take 20 years, but if we don't plant them today, we'll be having the same conversation in 20 years. Because I do think of some of the newer neighborhoods in Toronto where there are either very few trees in the segments of people's front lawns that are like city owned land, or
I think about Corktown, and this is not to say, not to second guess, like Corktown has these very wide rights of way with trees, but it almost seems like we could have done 10 times more trees. And I've mentioned before on the podcast, I was just recently in Mexico City, and like that like looks and feels really, really cool. So is there like a concerted effort to say like wherever there's a road widening required, wherever we're redoing a right of way, let's double and triple down on street trees?
Yeah. Oh, yes, very much so. And both in terms of like, the existing tree canopy, but also like how are we going to try to introduce a tree canopy in areas that are underserved today? And so I will tell you quite a lot of discussion. We're actually working through updates to the DIP standards and looking at a green streets approach to the DIP standards.
Sure, what are DIP standards?
This is the sort of the standards for if we're doing a new street construction. Okay. What are the engineering standards that go into that? And so, you literally get in debates and discussions about millimeters. Like every extra millimeter on a root ball setback from water main is a loss of a millimeter of soil volume for the street trees. You really get into these, especially if you're talking like a 18, 20 meter right of way where space is constrained. We're trying to kind of proactively think about how we would approach those conditions. I mean, you're always going to have a bit of site by site difference once you're actually doing a specific project. But I would say what forestry does very well is thinking about where are the needs, where are the growth pressures, and what are the conditions that we need to actually have a healthy tree canopy? Because again, what you see above grade is
reflects
is only 10% of the story. 90% of the story is what's happening below grade and the soil volume for the tree and all those sorts of things.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah. And the one downside I should say of Mexico City is you have these beautiful large trees in this canopy, and then you have to like squeeze like between them and the building.
Yeah, because the sidewalks,
which means the sidewalks are like not at all accessible. Like when you think about like AODA and stuff like that.
And then the root mass, I've walked the streets of Mexico City, the root mass is also pushing up the sidewalk. So like everything is like an unofficial sidewalk because you're kind of
it's walking over tree roots.
Yeah, and we have like planters as like an intermediary solution, but you're not going to get these like nice large trees out of a planter.
Yeah, you're not going to get the large trees. You're also not going to get the nice streetscape. They're
not as nice.
They're an okay solution in a highly constrained condition. But they're not delivering the kind of streetscapes that we really want to see.
Yeah, and I guess this is another thing. Like speaking of Mexico City, but any other cities, how much of your job is like let's just find, because like all of this physical competition for space is true everywhere. Like we all have plumbing, we all have electrical lines, we all have telecom, and so on. How much of this is like let's just go find the best and like copy paste?
Yeah, there's a fair bit of that, and sometimes it doesn't mean going to other cities. Sometimes it just means looking at our own streets and neighborhoods.
Sure. Yeah, what neighborhood has done it well?
Totally. Which if we're looking at the planning up at Downsview, it's like okay, the new Billy Bishop Road that's going to run is one of the main streets through Downsview. Well, how do we vision that? Is that a Queen Street? Is that a Young Street? Is that so? Like we have precedents here that we can draw on as well. But yeah, I do spend a fair bit of time, you thinking about, what other cities have done, and then importantly, like drilling into the details of that, because context can vary widely.
Yeah,
it's very easy to kind of look at Green Street in Copenhagen and be great. Let's just do that.
Yeah.
But you got to kind of do a bit of a step back and say, okay, why, what political context, legislative context kind of made that possible. So, those lovely skinny streets in Copenhagen, okay, but also they are lined with 5-story buildings, not 50-story buildings. So there you've got a sort of a different contextual element. I had a very interesting conversation, actually, speaking of Copenhagen, with one of the former city architects there about one of the new developments, which was lovely. It's called North Harbor, and mid-rise buildings, beautifully designed, really rich materiality, and just kind of asking them, as a municipal regulator or whatever your role is, how was this achieved? And the interesting thing was, talked about zoning standards, and they had very strict zoning standards about the size of the building envelope, and then they also had attached to their zoning standards a materials palette. So the zoning dictated the materiality they could use in the buildings. It's like, okay, I'm not sure that would go over so well. But take that one back to Toronto to say, hey, let's put different materials context, in different context. A lot of in their cases like built on public land, and so similar here, when you're building on public land, we have far more sort of levers and requirements, whether it's sustainability, affordability, whatever it might be. So I love getting inspiration from other cities, but I also love kind of like digging into the why.
I will say on urban design, if we could trade, and I think that a lot of this has gone away by now, if we could trade like an obsession with articulation for better materials, I think that would be like a win-win across the board.
I wanted to shift gears maybe, and if you wanted to finish the thought, but I'd love to talk about like the process within the planning department. Zoning reviews, zoning bylaw applications, SPA, what the requirements, the timelines, how you're thinking about tackling some of those bottlenecks that I think, are getting better, but people still sort of point to these as being limitations in terms of how fast you can get a project into the ground. What's the approach been? Where's that at in terms of reviewing the places where things just take longer than they maybe should?
Well, I think one of the big changes of the last, what would be, I guess, 2 years and a bit, is just the restructuring that happened within the planning department. So, we were talking about sort of Greg as the previous chief planner. The portfolio he had is different than the portfolio I now have, because we've created a whole new development review division that a different executive director leads. And part of the reason for that was around having some like focus and attention on that, and having my role focus more on the policy, the as of right zoning, those sort of things. I think that's gone, in my view, very well.
And for what's worth, Oren Tamir is the executive of the I think he's also great for the job. It seems like
and so and that has kind of revealed itself in the timelines that are being achieved. So I think we've seen much quicker timelines. I think within my portfolio, one of the reasons why I think looking at as of right zoning frameworks is so important.
You reduce some of these
ideally, you shouldn't need to come in for that rezoning application. Maybe a variance, but ideally not even a variance. So you can go straight into the site plan process. I think that's a big cost savings. That's a big timeline savings. And at the site plan stage, I think the site plan stage is an absolutely critical stage. I think most of the really big important decisions have historically happened at the site plan stage. I've got concerns that are what's happening right now in terms of provincial legislation that's scoping the role of site plan, that it may scope out some of actually the most important decisions that need to be made about new developments.
And scoping down specifically like what reports could be required on a checklist, like that sort of thing.
Some of the elements through the Toronto Green Standard, looking at sustainable design, looking at how you do parkland dedication and ROPS dedication. All of these things to me are critically and fundamentally important to the success of a development, to the quality of life that's going to be in the neighborhood around it. But we are also looking at the site plan process. Where we've been talking and doing some work around streaming the site plan process a bit, so that if you are doing, it is a different scale of issues that you need to look at for a small scale mid-rise building versus a 50-story tower. And that's not just a cost issue; it's partially a cost issue to the applicant, but also just the scope of review that we need.
It sort of disincentivizes this mid-scale, like, when we say mid-scale in our world, it's like, if you cross that 10-unit threshold and you hit site plan at 11 units, it's really unfeasible until you get to like 30 or 40 units, because it's just like an extra process burden, cost, uncertainty, all of the above, right? So scaling it down to
having a couple of different streams depending on the application type, depending on whether you're coming in through the as of right zoning, or building within the as of right zoning framework versus going through a rezoning process. So I think there's some work that can be done, and that is being done there around the site plan process. I think the urban design conversation that happens in the site plan process is really important. We've made a lot of changes to our urban design guidance. We talked about mid-rise, and one of the big moves of the past little while was sort of a rethinking the angular planes, trying to come up with a mid-rise design guideline that has much more simple building envelopes. For a whole host of good reasons, including facilitating mass timbers, facilitating modular,
and so we can spend more money on materials.
And there you go. Hopefully, spend some more money on materials. And really, kind of to me, a key focus on streetscape, on the kind of the first two floors, ones that really matter.
On this point of like getting more, as this is where I see like the overlap between development review and you is like just less process for them to expedite if it's more as of right. I remember when kind of like the first pass of these avenues went through, I think in like 2013, the official plan was updated, but the zoning bylaw was never updated to match. And like my kind of like follow the incentives take on this was that back then we had the Section 37 framework where you basically pay a fee for any density bonus beyond the as of right permission, and it almost creates this disincentive to get the bylaw to like what it should be, because then you can't charge Section 37. Now that we've moved to the community benefit charge, and maybe it's just a different philosophy for how we think about planning, I think this is one of the things that's very encouraging about the new avenue work is like, let's designate new and expanded avenues, let's update the official plan, and let's not forget to update the zoning bylaw so that in like an ideal world, we go straight to site plan.
And there's still some clunky overlaps, right? Like we just came through our approval on our major streets building on Kipling that we mentioned. And now that you've got these unique situations where you've got a as of right permission going to committee, but requiring site plan approval. And then the site plan approval process and the committee process are happening in parallel, but they are very interdependent, right? So it's sort of, you can theoretically run them in parallel, but in reality, you're waiting for a relative conclusion on one before you know you're going to get the zoning permission on the other. And that creates like a whole other process that is relatively new for some of these newer permissions. One topic that came up, and Blair Scorgi, I think, when we had him on the podcast, we were talking about minor variances and the ability of city staff to be more actively involved in approving certain types of variances. And I know this might be an Oren question more than you, but as you think about as of right permissions and you think about the role of committee variances, like, is there a conversation happening about where committee fits, where it doesn't fit, what role staff should have in these types of conversations?
Yeah, there is. And you're right. As you move towards more of an as-of-right zoning framework, the committee does become more and more important, because for a lot of applications, significant scale applications,
they're big files. Right?
The only touch point at the zoning stage is it's no longer going to be with planning and development review on a rezoning application. It's going to be only with the C of A on a variance. We're going to see more of that. So we have been having some discussions about what role planning staff, development review staff play when it comes to a C of A application. One recent change was actually C of A used to be in city planning. C of A staff used to be in city planning and have moved to development and review. So they're kind of more part of that development review process. And we've been looking at kind of the when and where do city staff provide planning comments on a C of A application. Generally speaking, it's usually only been more when there's a concern or a problem or a requested condition, something like that.
It's either silence, which was great, or opposition.
So something we certainly heard is both from applicants, residents, and members of the committee is, when
it'd be helpful to know what the staff
thinks. Have that kind of like 2-paragraph letter saying,
especially when it's new policy.
Especially when it's new policy. And, that's a lot of pressure on the C of A. We've had so much change in the zoning framework.
It is a lot of
2-3
context years for them to be aware of, educated on. There's a lot there.
And suddenly they are seeing a variance tied to a 6-story building on a major street. That's not the kind of thing they have seen before. So we've also talked about the guidance materials, the training materials we're providing to C of A. So that's been a very active area of review internally. We also had some mayor's direction on that in terms of some reforms to the C of A process, and I think those are all important because it is going to be a really important step.
And for what it's worth, we got one of these letters from city staff. We got Kipling applications.
We got a information report, which was I think very helpful. One version of this that goes even further than what you're saying would be the idea of delegated authority. Would that be just organizationally? Would that be a development review thing? Would that be a planning thing? A bit of both?
We haven't done any sort of detailed work on it. I wouldn't necessarily be able to say where it might lie. I mean, there's there's risks that come along with that as well in creating a whole new process, pathway.
Totally.
And what do appeal rights look like in that kind of system? Are there appeal rights? All these kinds of things. Like that's
a good point.
To
me, legal appeal, a delegated authority decision. Yeah.
Like it'd
be weird.
There's some complexities in process. Like what does an application look like? What forms do you have to fill out? All these sorts of things. So the focus right now has been on how can we make the C of A process as effective as it can be. And like I think there's a lot of good things you can expect to see there in the coming months.
Yeah. The city announced a pilot on an AI-enabled sort of zoning review tool, if I'm not mistaken. What is that? How real is it? How quickly should we expect?
Might be questions, to be fair. Feel free to
more of a Toronto Buildings question. So it's being led through the Buildings Department and the Chief Building Official. But it's really quite interesting. It's being tested to actually have that first the OBC compliance review happen through sort of more of an automated AI. And where it's really helpful, because I've seen some of the the demonstrations of how it works, is a lot of times if on a building permit application.
You say
what's that?
How good have these demos been?
Good.
Because you would think, in theory, AI current state of the art AI should be good at this.
And where it seems to be, at least in my view, particularly helpful is a lot of times on first submission. It's more a question of some boxes weren't filled out or some particular materials weren't applied or there's an error in a calculation. You don't want to wait for first as an applicant. You don't want to wait
6 weeks
to be told
there's a typo.
I missed it. So being able to do that yourself.
Even just knowing that there's a complete
submit to say, I don't have any basic missing. And you can get that in a few seconds. You're not wasting staff's time having to go through and be like, you didn't stamp it. That's not good use of our time either. So that's where I actually see significant value.
Like a preliminary review.
It's a bit of a completeness review, whatever you want to call it. And then when there actually is an actual application that goes to an actual plans examiner at the city, they're actually dealing with a full, complete, accurate package. I think that's one of the biggest kind of potential benefits and upsides of it.
On the policy side, one thing that would help the AI if we want to make life easier for the robots is there's so much now in the bylaw, like as an example, in this part of town where we're building, if you have a 1 to 10 slope on your roof, your sidewall could be 10 meters. If it's less than that, it can only be 7.5 meters. How much are we thinking about let's just declutter some of the stuff that's just not that important anymore?
Decomplexifying zoning, especially semi-terminary. We had 1,000 OPAs or something like that since the official plan was first adopted, whatever.
So there's just all this
25 years ago
stuff.
So I think I wouldn't say the reason to decomplexify is to facilitate AI review. There's all sorts of good reasons to do it even without the existence of AI. But that certainly does create challenges if you're building in one part of the city and the other, and then the requirements are slightly different.
Or we had 3 contiguous lots, and 2 of the lots were the old North York bylaw, and these were identical buildings. One was a new city, so it's completely it's just like this kind of just
clean up,
like Mary Kondo, just kind of clean it up.
The remnants of pre-amalgamation bylaws are still very much out there. Each time we bring forward sort of a new as of right zoning regime, we try to clean some of that up and have some fairly clear citywide standards. Even that, sometimes you get some, geographic specific nuance introduced in those as well. But I'd agree that is that's an issue. But I would say also, the challenge with zoning is we do have a very diverse city, and we do have very different neighborhoods and neighborhood contexts and lot patterns and all of these sorts of things. So, creating one clean, every standard is exactly the same. It's not only challenging, it sometimes wouldn't be desirable.
I think one thing that's interesting on that point about the multiplex bylaw, because in a part of the city where multiplexes are permitted, which they are now permitted, like different unit counts and so on, some of these things are just less relevant. So because I take your point on different parts of the city are different, but I also see the desirability of what I see happening through the multiplex bylaw is R zone type permissions just kind of spreading into RD, RS, and at some point, even taking your point on the complex, a lot of that maybe is just you just pick different architects and have different materials for different parts of the city, but Is there a part of you that thinks like if we just had like one zone, like one R zone within the residential areas, obviously we need other zones for other areas, and it's just like, it's just like let's fully complete amalgamation in a way that wasn't completed when we amalgamated.
Yeah, I don't know if it's exactly that is the solution, but having clear, more simplified, more consistent zoning standards, I think is definitely something we're working towards. And I think you've seen it in some of the more recent zoning initiatives, like multiplexes,
Absolutely.
where it's like,
which
we
is
did bring forward multiplex with like 20 different setback standards.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
but one of the unfortunate parts, and this bleeds into politics a little bit. One of the unfortunate parts about how City Council has sort of approached these things is things like certain wards opting out of sixplex permission, so that on one side of the street you'll be allowed to build a sixplex permission, but on the other side not. Right. So I guess all of this stuff ends up having to interplay with the local politics and the local councillor and the maybe you don't want to talk too much about this, but it's an election year. Does that ramp up your busyness? Does that ramp down your busyness?
Ramps up the business on some things like applications, because of course if you're an applicant, if you need to get in before the July planning committee meeting, or you don't come until the end of the year. So I'd say my colleagues in development review are like really flat out now, and my staff who are involved in development applications as well, like that's a big ramp up. The big policy issues, we don't have a lot of those coming forward in the last few weeks of the term. It's
good to have fresh.
It's very busy, but it's on. But it's right now. There's a lot of applications we're trying to move forward before the break.
Maybe to wrap up, like what makes you hopeful about the future? We are going to have this election, which means a fresh mandate, which means maybe new direction or like continued direction. Like what would be a great next 4 years for you specifically, but planning department more generally?
So I'd say one thing I'm excited about is some really important heavy lifting has been done, like sticking on the housing for a moment, some really important heavy lifting has been done around, like, we got a lot of housing typologies that we can build in the city now that you couldn't build for a really long time.
Really long time.
I'm excited to see that happen. I'm excited to see what kind of the builder and design community does with some of that. I think there's a bit of a challenge moment here of like, those first multiplexes, those first mid-rise buildings, make them great. Build them in a way so that when a neighbor sees them, they don't go like, I'm going to fight like crazy to stop one of those coming in. It's like, I want one of those in my neighborhood. I want one of those on my street.
Or maybe more realistically, it's not as bad as I thought.
Okay.
It's higher for what you're saying. Let's make them beautiful. Yeah.
So that's actually a really exciting moment for the city. I also think, and we've talked mostly about housing today, but with my chief planner's hat on, we got a lot of work to do around transit and transportation, mobility, and parks and public space. And when I'm talking to residents groups, or I do a lot of walks with residents groups, that's actually a lot of what they're talking about. So like, you do hear a lot about some concerns about density and parking and traffic and those kinds of things. But quite often it's, we're worried our rec center is going to be at capacity, or we're worried that, we want more parks and public space to come along with this growth. They're worried about the loss of their, the restaurant they love on their main street. And is that going to turn into something?
Dentist office.
So, we need to be careful not to like, or maybe I need to be careful and as a chief planner and as the city planning team, not to be, solely focused just on housing. You've got to be thinking very carefully about the kinds of neighborhoods we're creating with that housing. So I think that's also going to be a really interesting part of the next couple of years.
Yeah, parks, it seems to me like this is like the win-win available to politicians, planners, and developers. It's like we should like spend as much money as possible on like parks because everybody loves parks.
The parks, the public space, the streetscapes we're creating when new development is happening, like that stuff is just so important. And I think it was actually in my first meeting with the mayor when I first started in the job, and I asked her, what are your priorities for the new chief planner? And we talked a lot about housing, obviously, and that's been a big priority for the mayor. But she also said something along the lines of like, but it's not just about the quantity of housing. Like you got to be thinking about the quality of neighborhood and all of these other things. And I think that's a really important part of what city planning needs to do.
Yeah. And to your first point, though, on the housing side specifically, I do think, the last few years have sort of been this ramp up of proof of concept on a lot of these building typologies. And so you see it in the numbers of building permits on garden suites, laneway suites, multiplexes, sixplexes. Now we'll see semi-house plexes. We're starting to see the first major streets buildings get approved. 4 years from now, we will have many, many, many examples of these things. And for better or for worse, we'll have evidence of like, how did the policy play out, right? And like, I think it's on us as an industry to a certain extent to make sure that we put our best foot forward. But we're going to see a ton of these things, right? 4 years is a long time. These are short build cycles. So unlike a big high rise that takes 6 years to get to completion, these are like 12-month, builds, right? So
you're absolutely right. And I'll tell you, it's planning. We're not planning on waiting 4 years. So we've been kind of on this cycle of every year and a half, 2 years, where we do a deep dive. So we're going to do it for multiplexes in 2027 will be our next kind of report on a deep dive review. We're going to do it for major streets, where we're looking at what's getting built. We're looking at variance activity, which zoning standards are constantly being varied. So maybe we should just update the parent zoning bylaw to address that. We're looking at what kind of tenure is being built, what kind of unit layouts are we seeing, what kind of bedroom counts are we seeing, so we can kind of learn from how the market is responding to the permissions that are out there. And if that means we want to tweak or amend or modify the permissions, then we can do that. So that's why I say it is kind of an interesting time. There's like this, and you can see, like new companies and industry forming around this, which is really exciting. And,
cool.
and from a general economic development standpoint, is
and I think at a scale that is a lot more interesting than just like massive, big developments, big developers, big subdivisions. Like, we're right in the middle of it with Toronto, the work we're doing at Toronto Standard, but also the Missing Middle Summit that we host. It's an industry that frankly 3 years ago didn't exist, right? Like, and now all of a sudden you've got companies maturing into real businesses, building these types of products.
And in many ways, kind of the holy grail is, can we make it scale? Can we make it scale to deliver the kinds of units that we need in the city? And there's a big onus on us in city planning to come up with as simplified a process and as simplified a set of standards and policy expectations as we can, so that, a builder who's trying to scale up, it doesn't have to have 15 different products that you bring to market because it's 15 different parts of the city that all have different standards. Like, as much as you can kind of get that consistency and replicability, that's a key thing that we're looking at. But if we can make it work, if we can hit that and get this scale of development to really take off, I think it's just a really exciting thing for the city.
I think it'll make the city better. Yeah. So with that said, maybe thank you for coming. Thank you for what you do, and maybe we'll check back in a year and see what's changed since then.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.